Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Please pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or visit the support links on our website, aroundtheempire.com. Columnist, editor, and well-known activist Margaret Kimberley joins us today to talk about a 1967 speech at the Riverside Church in New York City by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Beyond Vietnam, Time to Break the Silence. We talk about the prescience of this lesser-known but epic speech and its relevance today. We also talk more broadly about NATO, the new Cold War, the Yellow Vest protest in France, Brexit, Greece, and American politics. Margaret Kimberley is a senior columnist and editor at Black Agenda Report and an activist for peace and justice issues. Her work has been published in many newspapers and websites, and she's been a guest on radio shows around the country. Margaret has spoken at Riverside Church herself for seminars and student groups, and she speaks to us today from New York. This interview was recorded on January 28, 2019.
War in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. If we ignore this sobering reality, and if we ignore this sobering reality, we will find ourselves organizing clergy and laymen concerned committees for the next generation. They will be concerned about Guatemala and Peru. They will be concerned about Thailand and Cambodia. They will be concerned about Mozambique and South Africa. We will be marching for these and a dozen other names and attending rallies without end unless there is a significant and profound change in American life and policy. Such thoughts take us beyond Vietnam, but not beyond our calling as sons of the living God. In 1957, a sensitive American official overseas said that it seemed to him that our nation was on the wrong side of a world revolution. During the past 10 years, we have seen emerge a pattern of suppression which has now justified the presence of U.S. military advisors in Venezuela. This need to maintain social stability for our investments accounts for the counter-revolutionary action of American forces in Guatemala. It tells why American helicopters are being used against guerrillas in Cambodia, why American napalm and Green Beret forces have already been active against rebels in Peru. It is with such activity in mind that the words of the late John F. Kennedy come back to haunt us. 5 years ago he said, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." Increasingly by choice or by accident, this is the role our nation has taken, the role of those who make peaceful revolution impossible by refusing to give up the privileges and the pleasures that come from the immense profits of overseas investments. I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside. That will be only an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed, so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. True revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. With righteous indignation, it will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of the countries and say this is not just. It will look at our alliance with the landed gentry of South America and say this is not just. Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. A true revolution of values will lay hand on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of peoples normally humane, sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields, physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death.
Welcome, Margaret. Thanks for coming to Around the Empire. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So for our audience, I invited Margaret because, well, I followed her work for years and I'm excited to talk with her. And because I wanted to learn more about the Beyond Vietnam speech, to get some more perspective on it, and to bring it ahead 50 years, hard to believe, 50 years, and talk about what it means today. And also, as I was telling Margaret in the email, I was really late to the game with this speech. I really didn't even know much about it until maybe 15 years ago. And maybe somebody listening to this podcast will be in that same kind of situation and will discover it too. Because when I really listened to it, I was shocked by it, frankly, because that wasn't the image that I had of Martin Luther King. And it was a game changer for me, a real eye-opener, because, he really nailed it. Oh, talk about really describing exactly the situation as it was and predicting where it would go. And I tend to think that today it's even more relevant than ever.
Yeah, the first thing is you were unaware of the speech for so long. That is by design. The radicalism of King is minimized by the corporate media. On his birthday, what do we hear about? The I Have a Dream speech, as if he never said anything else. Actually, of all his best known speeches, I think it's one that's least significant. Yes, it was on the Mall in Washington at the Lincoln Memorial, and I understand that, and it was a huge effort. The Poor People's, it was supposed to be the Poor People's March on Washington, and even that got watered down in the process. But you hear more about that speech for a reason. In this speech he gave at Riverside Church, it was a year to the day before he was assassinated, April 4th, 1967. He drew a line in the sand. He broke with some of his colleagues. He attacked the president of the United States. And at the time, he was condemned. He wasn't praised by the New York Times and the Washington Post.
Yeah, I think it said that 168 newspapers denounced him the next day, including the New York Times. Yeah.
Of course. So, and they still don't want to talk about it 50 years later. But he, Johnson was seen as an ally of the movement. And he had been considering this, and every time he mentioned it to those closest to him, they always warned him against it. Well, Johnson's our friend. You don't want him to get mad. And he just said, to heck with it. I have to talk about this. And the speech resonates so much today because we're still dealing with the same issues.
Right.
King had started moving in a more radical direction, as he said publicly. And he knew that we could not have a country that met the needs of its people. And that was also a militaristic nation that was involved in this war of aggression on the other side of the world. He also knew that he was, as a Christian, he was supposed to care about everybody. He wasn't supposed to just care about Americans or even to care just about Black Americans. He had to show concern for the plight of the Vietnamese people who only wanted self-determination, who only wanted freedom, first from French colonialism and then from the U.S. empire. So he did the right thing, but he paid a price. People close to him were not happy. Lyndon Johnson was mad at him. He was criticized, as we've just discussed, in the media. But he realized that he had to speak to this issue. And I think ultimately he paid for it with his life. I don't think it's an accident that he was marked for assassination, marked for death, after he started talking about issues other than the freedom movement, the so-called civil rights movement, as most people say.
Right.
And once he started talking about economic issues, once he started expressing a more radical politics, I think that's when he was marked for death. And I don't think it's accidental that he was killed a year later.
Yeah, the first time I listened to this closely, I said, okay, this is why they killed him.
Mm-hmm.
I was just talking to my youngest son about this interview and about the speech and so on, and it caused him to actually look into it further. But I was explaining what I thought the message was and what I thought the speech was about, and then I said, and that the speech was given exactly 1 year before he was assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is why he was assassinated, and I think that it's not a coincidence that it was on that date. Now, he thinks he's like, I was with you up until the point where he said, it was exactly that date. Because, kids they think, my kids anyway, they'll always be like, I don't know, Mom. I don't know, Mom. I think maybe you took that a little too far, Mom.
Well, that's, I had thought about it too. It's that it was not a coincidence. I mean, it's the sort of thing that you can never prove, but I don't think you're off base in having that thought.
Well, I mean,
I'll put it that way.
I thought the message would, if it was deliberately done on that date, I don't know how well they could plan exactly what day they were going to assassinate him. I'm sure it was in the works for a while, but
yeah,
I thought the message was to other civil rights leaders. I mean, at that point in time, they didn't know if someone was going to rise up in his place. So, I think they were saying intersections like this between the civil rights movement and the peace movement's not allowed. And the poverty, you're just not allowed.
That's when people are marked to be taken out, is when they bring, I think what the system fears most is that people will unite and will work together on a common goal. So I think they, it's like, okay, you can do stuff for Black people. That's all right. And by that time, the die was cast, and They knew segregation was over. So that was okay. But he's talking about the military industrial complex.
Oh, yeah.
Now he's talking about US hegemony. Now he's talking about economic issues. He's talking about making poverty in the US. And I think it's so ironic. There's worse poverty now, 50 years later. So he was talking about all the things that are fundamental to the system, that uphold the system. And that's when he was taken out. That is the moment when he was killed, when Malcolm X was killed, when Fred Hampton was killed in Chicago, young Black Panther, just 21. He and another young man, Mark Clark, killed in their sleep. Of police and FBI just shot their apartment building full of bullets and killed them. And that was after he began speaking about issues beyond those of that appeared to be of immediate concern only to Black people. So I don't think those things are accidental. It's not accidental that that king is disappeared from the history books, disappeared from the media. And I mean, if you watch TV on his birthday, you would think he gave one speech, that was a very nice man, and he had a dream, and the dream was for Black and white children to hold hands or something like that. And you wouldn't know anything else about him. You wouldn't know anything about his politics. You wouldn't know that for most of his life, actually, he was criticized by the media. If you ever get the chance to see these old interviews on Meet the Press or those shows of that nature, they were not friendly interviews, in my opinion. So I think it's important to know that he was marked by the FBI. I mean, they sent him this letter telling him he should kill himself. And that's another thing that has been disappeared. It's like, well, this movement happened and Black people got to vote and that was the end. And
well, we have to bring up here then what the FBI did on Martin Luther King Day this year for anyone who may have missed it.
What was that?
On Twitter, they sent out
I did see that. I don't think it was this year. I think it was last year. This year they had the decency to not say anything. But the fact that they ever did that at all, the COINTEL program, the counterintelligence program, crushed the movement. It destroyed the Black Panther Party. And that's also disappeared. The fact that the government played a role in literally killing people and in destroying these movements. So, you're not alone in finding things out late in life. There's so many things I've learned. I'm 59, and there are things that I've only learned in my 50s, and sometimes it's embarrassing. It's like, why didn't I know this before? But it's not by accident. It's the most important issues and the things we ought to know about history are deliberately kept from us.
Yeah. I don't know if there's been a speech like this since. Of the speeches that I know, and from my perspective, of course, I think this is one of the most, if not the most important speech like there ever has been in this country. That's how powerful I think it was. And I mean, it was clear to me that he knew that he was going to get a lot. I suspect he knew he was going to get a lot of backlash from this, because this speech is, first of all, it's epic. It's like an hour-long speech.
Yes.
And it's amazingly carefully structured and organized essay, like with well-thought-out arguments. It's loaded with detail. It has both historic detail and persuasive, arguments. He lays out 7 major reasons for why he came to this decision. He says, for bringing Vietnam into the field of my moral vision. And then in the middle of the speech, he lays out 5 sort of demands. He calls them concrete things that our government should do, and they're all pretty radical things. But it's when he gets into describing the root of the problem, because he says that it's a far deeper malady within the American spirit, right? So he foresees the same imperial adventures. He says if we don't do something about this now, it's going to be. He names a bunch of countries like Guatemala and Peru and Cambodia and Mozambique and so on. And he says to this group of activists. I also want to ask you about who was in that church at the time, but he's saying, like, we can't just march and go home. We can't just think of this as a project. He said that we have to get on the right side of what he saw as a world revolution, the decolonialism, I guess, that was still going on at that time. And what people have to remember is, I mean, we were little kids when this was all going on, and you might have some memory of this. I don't remember that much of it, but I do remember some. I remember the assassinations, and I was a little kid at the time.
Yeah,
right? So,
I was 8 years old, and King and Bobby Kennedy were killed.
Yeah, well, I do remember those. I remember the unrest. I remember one of my first memories. We had I have a lot of siblings, so we didn't go on vacations that much. We didn't go on that many trips, but my parents did take us to Washington, D.C. in 1968, and we visited Arlington Cemetery, and we visited Bobby Kennedy's grave, which was, even though this was some months later, the grave was still, the grass hadn't grown on it, and there were just piles and piles of flowers. And so you would think that would be my memory, was just sort of all those flowers and all the people. But what I remember most is my parents. I remember how the expression, when you're a little kid, you're really tuned into your parents' emotions. And I just remember how devastated they were.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I come off on a tangent, but
it's okay. It's a touchstone for us. So
yeah.
So yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I can understand that, and just in having this conversation with you, I'm realizing how much has been lost. In 1968, you had the right to public assistance, and that was done away with by Bill Clinton, a Democrat. There's more poverty. We've reached, and I'm not a Marxist, so I probably shouldn't try to explain this, but many students of Marx say this is the final stage, the end stage of capitalism, and the movement ended just as that stage began. I did it earlier this year. Actually, now it's last year. Last April, I was asked to write an article in Consortium News, which I recommend everybody read. Consortium News, it's great, and about the 50th anniversary of King's death. When King was alive, there were only 300,000 people incarcerated in the entire country, and there are now more than 2 million.
Wow.
And that's not a coincidence. That was a direct response to the end of legal segregation. Black people could not be controlled as easily. And so the prison system became bigger and bigger. And now it's privatized, and corporations make money incarcerating people. It's quite horrible when you see how things have gone. It's very odd. Things have gotten better for many individuals. And I'm going to include myself and my family in that. But overall, if you look at what's happening in the world with this acceleration of U.S. imperialism, which was in some, after the Vietnam War, it took them about 20 years before they tried to attack another country.
Yeah.
The first war in Iraq was almost 20 years after the Vietnam War ended. But since then, there was another war, an invasion and occupation of Iraq. And now we have war by other means, war through proxies, wars through sanctions, and U.S. bases all over the world, depending on how you count facilities as bases, between 800 and 1,000. In more than 100 countries all over the world. A military budget that literally keeps us from having nice things. It's more than 60% of the discretionary spending in the United States. And so we should be talking about what he said. Now it's literally true. We cannot have, any of the things progressive people talk about, free college or improving the infrastructure, or, why does China have, high-speed rail and we don't? Any number of things. You can't have it with military spending at the levels that we have it now. And it was one of the things that King warned about when he gave that speech.
Right, he really did. And you have to remember that this was 1967 when he gave the speech. So we're talking about, it's just a little more than 20 years since the World War II has ended. Mm-hmm. And we don't see ourselves as an empire. We definitely don't. I think American people don't realize that it's an imperial project yet. Mm-hmm. And I think people are not coming to that conclusion really until recently. But, he's very directly calling out imperial tendencies, imperial actions, and he's saying that this is a critical point in time, that this, has to be addressed right now, because he sees exactly where this is going. He says, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. And right around that same time, he says, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. So, he calls out the militarism, and he sees that and he spells out, you could certainly explain it better than I can, that mm-hmm. Earlier, I guess, during the time when he gave his I Have a Dream speech, there were the Great Society programs, and he saw a practical way that the resources of this country could be devoted to, addressing the issues of poverty and racism. But once the Vietnam War escalated and he saw the resources being drawn into that, he realized what it was going to take away from.
Yeah. Yes, he did. And I think it's ironic. You just reminded me of something. Now you go shopping and you buy some cheap clothes. It says made in Vietnam. So after all of that and their own struggle, now it's just a cog in the machine, a place for cheap labor where they make, Nikes and other stuff. So what the hell was that for? That, all these theories of the domino theories of communism, and although now we've seen the domino theory goes the other way, as the Soviet Union collapsed and all the surrounding countries are now members of NATO. But at any rate, I'm getting off base a little bit. But it was prophetic. I guess that's, if I had to use one word to sum it up, truly prophetic. And when you think about technology, and the technology that allows us to talk right now, and for
right.
for me to be talking on a little phone that I carry around in my pocketbook is a great tool, and I use it all the time. But we now also see that we have become ensnared by technology, by the ease and convenience of it. And no, I'm not going to turn back the clock and not use my cell phone or not be on social media. That's not going to happen. But we have voluntarily given up our privacy. The NSA has records of all our calls, all our emails, all our social media posts, and we are voluntarily giving why do they want it? It can't be for any good purpose.
Right.
It's to control us, or to, it's like, I feel like it's safekeeping. It's like, and just in case they start protesting again, we'll be able to connect this one with that one. And but that's where we are, where we have a bigger military budget, the United States having a bigger footprint all over the world, and all in all, a worse situation, a situation now where, and 50 years ago, rich people paid more taxes. we had a social safety net. We had a regulation of the banks. The clock has been deliberately turned back. And people like him who had that, who were so prescient and saw the direction that things could be going in, deserve to be studied. But as I said, that's why this speech is not the one that's given so much attention around the time that we celebrate, or I say very often celebrate his birthday.
Yeah, and I don't know when that happened, because when he gave the speech, like I had heard of it before, and I heard Riverside Church, and for some reason I was thinking, oh, Riverside Church is probably a church in a rural area, but it's not. It's it's like a cathedral, right?
It is. It's like, I used to be a member, in fact. The Riverside Church has an interesting history. It was founded by the Rockefeller family, and it is in the style of a Gothic cathedral in Manhattan. The neighborhood's called Morningside Heights. It's right near Columbia University, a couple of blocks before you get to what most people think of as Harlem. And it's a huge structure. It's a well-endowed congregation. It has a liberal reputation, which I have to say, frankly, I don't think it deserves as much anymore. But yes, it's excuse me, it was and is a focal point of attention here in New York City. So it was huge that he gave the speech in this rarefied place, an establishment church, a church of the elite, so to speak. And so he was challenging many people. I'm sure many of those who were sitting and listening to him. So yes, it's yes. I know when you think of the song "Down by the Riverside," you don't.
And it just the name. The name sounds like it's a rural church or something. But
yeah.
When I actually looked into it, I thought, wow, he was taking it right to the belly of the beast.
Yes, he was. And they took it back to him, and it was, he was a man who could get a meeting with the president, but he took this stand and was disinvited from the White House, and he said, "That's what I need to do." It was a great act of bravery. It really was, and it deserves far more attention than it has gotten.
Now, it sounds like from the audio in it, I don't know if I've seen any pictures of that night or that day, but it sounds like the crowd, that was a very large crowd. Do we know sort of who was there?
That's a good question. I believe John Lewis was there, the now congressman, who I'm not a big fan of. He gets, a lot of mileage out of his the work in his youth. I give him credit where it's due for what he did at the time. Now he's just a regular, neoliberal Democrat who sneered at the idea of free college.
It's a shame.
I know he was there. I know some other of his colleagues were there, but I would have to look that up. I'm not certain who else was there.
Yeah. And we can guess it's probably the congregation of the church. And
yes.
But also the response to it. I just read again Michelle Alexander's recent op-ed in the New York Times, where she also invoked this speech, and she's applying it to Palestine, which is it's a huge deal. But she, I forget what I was just going to say, why I brought that part up.
They say there's some commonality between the two.
Yeah, I forget why I brought that up, but anyway, well, I may as well just switch over to that. So she invokes this speech and she applies it pretty directly to Palestine. And at the very end, she says, I don't know much about Alexander, but this I thought was a great op-ed. She says, "In this new year, I aim to speak with greater courage and conviction about injustices beyond our border." And I thought, well, I'm going to hold you to that. I wonder if it's going to be, is she just talking about the Palestine area, or, because it can be widely applied. Now, as we said, the imperialism has only grown, and after 9/11, it grew like exponentially. So, but I was also, this gave me some hope that maybe maybe the anti-war movement, or at the very least, whatever you want to call it. And if you don't want to be anti-war, anti-interventionist, anti-imperialist, I don't know what you want to call it, but is this finally going to get some traction? Because it's been on the decline for a long time, and I think it's possibly at its lowest point right now because we have the Democrats, who you sort of rely on to be at least somewhat anti-war, they've just gone full on hawk now.
Oh, sure. And Democrats have started many wars. And the anti-war movement, it is a shame. Now, I am active in certain groups, and there is hope. There is hope. I'm on the coordinating of Black Alliance for Peace, and we were formed 2 years ago on April 4th, 2017, and that date we chose deliberately because it was the 50th anniversary of King's speech. And as the name implies, we're a Black-led movement. We believe, I believe it is quite true. You must have a Black presence in the anti-war movement, and that has declined for many reasons. The country has moved further and further to the right. We now have a far-right party and a center-right party. I don't even know if the Democrats are center-right anymore, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, from my perspective anyway.
Yeah. So our goal and that of other organizations, I'm also on the administrative committee of UNAC, the United National Anti-War Coalition. And on April 4th, we and other organizations are going to be in Washington. NATO is having its 70th anniversary, and it's on April 4th. So NATO foreign ministers are going to meet in Washington.
Oh, really?
For some sort of, I don't know, meeting, celebration, who knows. And I have to say, it's a bit tricky nowadays with people thinking of NATO as this defender of independence and democracy.
Of the free world.
Yeah, I hate that term, the free world. But anyway, but NATO is it is the means by which the capitalist imperialist countries of Europe and the US and Canada, how they make their plans to ensure domination. It is NATO that destroyed Libya. It is NATO that has led the attempt at regime change in Syria. And it's confused now because Trump makes these, people think he's making these anti-NATO statements. In fact, he's pushing the other countries to spend more money on war, is what he's doing.
And he was just praised by the Secretary General because he's extracted another $100 billion. And now they're praising him.
Yeah, it's horrible. So there's Trump is full of, we could have a whole conversation about him.
Exactly.
He presents so many contradictions that he says, he says he likes war, and he always talks about we should get the oil, but then he will say, but he's not the first one to lie and say he didn't want regime change wars. And now, of course, that's exactly what's going on in Venezuela.
Yep.
And we must oppose that vociferously. Oppose all U.S. interventions around the world, just on principle. And people can get confused by what the media may say about a certain foreign leader. And, the more they demonize someone, that means they want to get rid of that person. But the only thing that people need to know about Venezuela is that the people there have voted for this government. They voted for Chavez. They are voting for Maduro. That is what they want, and that's the end of the story. And the United States has no right to strangle their economy. People are going hungry there because of the sanctions. It's like breaking into somebody's house and trashing it, and then pointing to it and say, "Oh, look, this is messy." So the United States and Canada, and you can see they're showing their true colors. Trudeau in Canada is supposed to be a liberal. Canada is part of this coup attempt. The Western European nations, Maduro has to call for new elections in a week, or they're going to recognize this guy who declared himself the president. It's horrible. And it is war by other means. They are trying to do it without sending U.S. troops. That's the thing they learned from Iraq, was to make war on nations with, and to try not to send U.S. troops anywhere. They don't want to do that because that does focus public opposition, sending U.S. troops anywhere. So they prefer not to do it. I'm not going to say they never will again. But this is the sort of thing we have seen. The anti-war movement was done in by the Democratic Party. It seemed to be going somewhere at the time of the Iraq War, but the Democratic Party disassociated itself from it completely. And then Obama's election, it was more anti-Republican, really, and more anti-George Bush, and it really was anti-war. So Obama gets elected, and he, cultivates this image as being the peace candidate, which he never was. And he did terrible things. The drone strikes, the destruction of Libya, the attempt to destroy Syria, those were horrible things. But people had glommed onto him as this savior. And so it was hard for people. It's still hard. He's not even president anymore. It's still hard for people to admit what he did.
And what he didn't do,
What he did and what he didn't, yes, actively and passively, the damage he did to the world. So it's difficult now being anti-war. And now, since 9/11, there has been a constant state of war. So people who were born 9/11, 2001 are now, they're almost adults. They're 17 years old.
And my kids really don't really remember a time when we weren't at war.
Of course they don't. And those of us even who are adults, now it's just like this background noise. And, you sort of you accept that it's okay, that there was a war of terror and it had to be done. And so you really, really have to make an effort to think differently and not accept that. And so we are swimming against the tide, and the corporate media, the Democratic Party. And I don't know if you noticed how many Democrats who generally were criticizing Trump about the shutdown and claiming he was Putin's puppet. And as soon as he did the imperialist thing and announced that the United States was trying to overthrow the elected government of Venezuela, there were Democrats who said it was a good thing.
Yeah, they're backing him.
And it's very difficult in this country where the little bit of activism that's cultivated is electoral activism. And Democrats, I believe, treat politics like it's some kind of a religion. And the Democrats are good and the Republicans are bad. I believe the Republicans are bad, but I don't think the Democrats are good. But with Trump's election especially, this is a very difficult time to criticize the Democrats. If you say anything, the first question is, do you like Trump? Would you rather have Trump?
Are you a Putin bot?
Yes, that too. And no, I don't want Trump, but I want a real People's Party. And to sum up, I believe we must replace the Democratic Party. We need a real People's Party, a real Workers' Party, a real Peace Party. And as long as we treat these horrible people like they're our savior, the worst things will be, because all we have is, and now I'm quoting from my colleague at Black Agenda Report, Glenn Ford, all the system offers us is austerity and permanent war. And they may change the personalities. So they get, Obama is the person who, I can't remember his line, Obama was backed by the left and Goldman Sachs, as he put it. So that's all that we're told we can have. But I don't believe that's all we can have. But it's a problem all over the world. It's a problem that Trudeau or, Merkel and all these people, they march in lockstep when the U.S., they're talking about puppets. The so-called free world nations, they're all vassals of the United States and do whatever the United States tells them to do. Raise your military budget. Okay. Help us destroy Venezuela. All right.
I was surprised to see that they fell in line on that one. Even Spain did,
Sure they did. And what nerve. I mean, the colonial nation, Jesus, what? Yeah, it seems even worse coming from them. But for Macron in France, his approval rating is in the basement. And these yellow vest protests have been going on for several months now. This is not a flash in the pan. But for him to say that somebody else has to do something by call new elections or he's out, he should be out.
He praised their opposition too,
Of course he did.
While he's got
All
yellow
of them
vests,
have.
he's cracking down. He's using his police forces to crack down on his own opposition.
Yes,
and he's
he
praising
is.
Venezuelans. I mean, oh my God.
Yeah. So we're up against it, but it's good to see what we're up against, and to see that there's an entire system that is upholding imperialism and surveillance against us and austerity against us. I mean, that's why you have a yellow vest movement. French workers were accustomed to having living wage jobs, having a good welfare state for themselves. And the EU, and that, it's so funny. Everything we're told that is good is not. The EU, there are countries that are richer and poorer. So, for example, French companies will set up shop in Poland, an EU member state, because it's cheaper labor. So, of course, people in France are mad about that. Their jobs are being sent someplace else. That was one of the causes of Brexit. Brexit is not just and it was pushed by segments of the right wing. But I think it bears paying attention to why people would do that. It's a similar thing. People from Romania or Slovakia show up in England and work for less money. The British state is on this horrible campaign of austerity, and they were workers in the UK were suffering because of it. And so people in London voted for Brexit because that's part of the plan. Everything's good in the capital city, and screw the rest of the country. So people in the hinterlands voted for Brexit. Yep. And which is now quite a mess. But I'm not sad to see the mess. The axis of the United States and Europe has done a lot of damage to the world. And the sooner it all falls apart, the better. We have to talk about what's going to replace it and what we do next, but it is not a bad thing. Brexit is not a bad thing. France leaving workers wanting to leave the EU and Europe, it's not a bad thing. Look what the EU did to Greece. The elites got all this money, the people didn't, and then Germany and other countries said, too bad, you pay up, and impoverished this nation. So we have to be careful what we defend, and not make assumptions about some, sometimes more complicated issues.
Right, and question the way things are framed, the narratives that are put out there, because they're, I would say at this point, almost always not an accurate picture. And sometimes they're very sophisticatedly, whatever, crafted message that is, pull back the curtain a little bit and have a better look at the real reasons for things, because it's usually driving down the cost of labor, and or extracting resources, stealing people's stuff. Like it's almost always things like, and war profiteering. I mean, those are sort of at the root of so much of what's going on. We have to be careful.
Yeah, capitalism in short. Everything you said describes capitalism. That is the problem.
I don't know what system could replace it. I've never seen any of them in their purest forms. I guess none of them have really ever existed in their purest forms. But we're at hyper capitalism at this point. I think something's got to give. I mean, it's going to collapse. I don't see how we can continue like this, because I don't think that the world is, like you said, a lot of things are coming to light. So if there's anything good that came out of the era of Trump, it's that he's not a sophisticated, charismatic figure that can pull off these sophisticated narratives and sell people on things and make them still think that they're the good guys.
Right.
He really doesn't have any interest in any of that. He's just very, let's just say, I don't know what you call it, just brazen, I guess.
Yeah, he is.
So,
He's a very base person,
yeah,
I would say. And he's like the worst person. He's like the dumb person on your job, except he's the president. Um, but he connected with millions of people for that reason. I mean, he says the things that, white middle America say, if it weren't for us, you'd be speaking German, or we should grab the oil, or we need to build a wall. I mean, looking back, I should have seen when he talked about building a wall and immigrants being criminals, that he was going to get millions of more votes than I thought. I never thought it was going to be a landslide,
no,
but
neither did I.
I thought it would be closer than they said. But I did think, I did not realize at the time that Hillary Clinton was nickel and diming the get out the vote effort, and that they had rigged it all against Bernie Sanders. But where was I? I went off a bit, but
Well, Venezuela, we can't stop thinking about Venezuela. We were
no, we
talking about
cannot.
the EU and what they did to Greece, and you have to remember that, after Germany refused to give even an inch, they also went in and, they looked at the state assets and they started buying up the more profitable ones. So,
Yes.
if you have a socialistic system, you have, I mean, that's how you put the internet out to rural areas where it's not profitable. That's how you have an airport in an area where it's not profitable. You have some assets that are very profitable and you have others, you know, and it balances out. But they went in and they're starting now to sell off ports and the more profitable, valuable assets. So they're just further undermining, it's not only what they did out in the open to the Greek people, it's the long-term undermining of the country that they also did that nobody really talks about, that the selling off of the state assets. Um,
Sure. They did. It sounds like Detroit. I wrote a column about it at the time, about Greece being like Detroit. Um, yeah, and you see what happened with the supposedly left-wing party in Greece. They said they were going to say no. And it's interesting. I remember at the time following this on social media, and of course I'm in contact with like-minded people, and you think something's going to happen, that somebody's going to stand up and do something. And the Greek people voted no, and they went right along with it. And people are suffering. They would have been attacked had they said we're leaving the EU and we're going to start printing our own currency again. But they betrayed people. I don't think that's too strong a term. They
uh,
talked out of both sides of their mouths, and at the end of the day, they went along with their masters and did as they were told. And so we see this all the time. There's supposed to be a left-wing party in Spain, supposed to be a left-wing party in Greece, when it looks like there might be a slightly left-wing party in England. I mean, it's no accident that they're smearing Jeremy Corbyn. They are determined to keep him from being prime minister because he would change a little bit.
yeah, even just slightly more in favor of the
Yeah,
populace.
yeah.
Yeah,
And it's, you were mentioning the press and how hard it is to discern things. That's because they lie. They just lie.
yep.
And they leave things. There is, I don't know if you've heard about this integrity initiative.
Yes, I have.
And I don't know if your listeners know about it. And if you don't know about it, it's because the corporate media has disappeared the story. But this was a supposed charity in the UK, and its goal was to, fight Russian disinformation. Well, it turns out it's a cutout for their surveillance state, for their MI6. They cultivate journalists in the UK and around the world. There's a guy affiliated with them who just showed up, coincidentally, to volunteer on Bernie Sanders' campaign in
Yeah, how about that?
2016. So it's a part of the surveillance state. Fortunately, hackers, the anonymous group, got these documents, thank God. But the story is not as well known as it should be. New York Times has not written a word about it. I don't think the Washington Post has said anything about it. But this is what they're doing in the so-called democracies. And I think we have to stop calling countries democracies, because that's just what we're used to say. We don't live in a democracy here. They let us vote, but it's after people with money have decided who gets to run.
Yeah.
And it's been, I mean, we can see it with our own two eyes, but there are people who've studied it, and they show that even when we vote for, when somebody we want gets into office, we still don't get what we want. Most Americans want Medicare for all. Are you kidding? If the average person had anything to do with it, we'd have Medicare for all, but we don't have anything to do it. And the Democrats are bought off by their corporate donors, and they want to keep us from getting that and other things that we need. So we need to stop saying we're a democracy. The Russiagate, we touched on Russiagate a little bit. I believe Russiagate is completely bogus. There is so far no evidence of collusion with Russia. I'll give you an example. Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, it's true, he sent an email to the Kremlin, but he didn't know anybody there. He used the Contact Us page on the Kremlin website. He literally did not know anybody to contact. And when they got back in touch with him, they blew him off. And that's just one example. Roger Stone was indicted. Basically, he lied about, he claimed to be in touch with WikiLeaks when he wasn't.
He was boasting.
Trump himself, he got himself into this mess with his stupid lies. I did deals in Russia. He didn't. He just didn't. Rich Russians buy apartments in Trump Tower, and that's pretty much it. People have been found guilty. Manafort of cheating on his taxes. Flynn lied about meeting the Russian ambassador, but he met the Russian ambassador because Israel asked him to, in order to try to get the Russians from voting for an anti-Israel resolution at the UN Security Council. So I could go on and on and on, but it kills many birds with one stone. It gets the Democrats off the hook for losing in 2016, and it allows them to ramp up the attack on Russia. It is amazing to me. In my entire life, I have never seen anything like this anti-Russian propaganda.
I have not either. I'm glad you said that, because I've been saying the same thing. It's unprecedented. I've never seen anything like this. And in fact, sort of double whammy, because I've never seen anything like this coordinated. Well, let me just get down to it. I really do think that Russiagate, in addition to all the things that you just said, is also about one important thing, and that's covering up what the Obama administration, what the Hillary campaign and the Obama administration did to try to undermine the Trump campaign during the election.
Absolutely.
And they turned it all around,
Yes, because, and Trump and his people are stupid, and, so they've walked into some of this. But the press are in the tank for the Democrats. They were for Hillary all along. She, I believe, if you look at the story, let's not forget what the story of her emails was about. She, as the Secretary of State, never used the State Department server system. Instead, she kept a server in her house. Now, I'm sorry. That means she was hiding something. And I think she was trying to hide her continued involvement with the Clinton quote unquote foundation, which is really just a slush fund. And I think she was spying on Trump. She wanted to find or create dirt on him to cover up when her dirt came out. So the Democrats are the ones who paid for the Steele dossier. We're told that some British guy just wrote a dossier, and he's former MI6 agent. He was hired by the DNC. And that means there are links between Hillary Clinton and the surveillance state in the U.S. and in the UK.
Well, that's one of the things I puzzled about was, everybody thought Hillary was going to win, including me, and really almost everyone did. And so why were they going after the Trump administration? Why did they need to even get this dirt? And I think you just hit on it. You gave the answer. It's just that they were trying to anticipate what there was so much, she has so much baggage. They were trying to anticipate what was going to come out on her. And I think that is probably why they surveilled the Trump campaign so much. And I think they did start to get worried a little bit toward like in August, September area when they're, he's having these giant rallies and she's collapsing on 9/11.
Yeah.
But
I'd
Yeah.
forgotten about that. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, and and instead of, and and as a lesson for everybody, that's what happens when you're doing the wrong thing. She actually won the popular vote. In order to win in those states that flipped, she just needed a good get out the vote effort. She
Yeah,
did
it was a
everything except
calculus.
the most basic thing to win. All she had to do, they set her up, be the Secretary of State, look presidential, and you're going to be the next president. So instead of just doing good works, she does things like give speeches with Goldman Sachs and make more money and help Bill out and help him make money, when she should have had a kick-ass outreach campaign in Michigan and Wisconsin. But,
Yeah, it's amazing. She had
and nobody, yeah, and
billions
this
of dollars.
sure, she raised more money than Trump did.
She had
And I don't want to,
every institution on her side, almost just about. But I can tell you that, I live down near Philadelphia, right?
mm-hmm.
And my partner's in southeast Pennsylvania, like south of Philadelphia. I can tell you that there were Trump signs all over the place and no Hillary signs, or just one or two here and there. And so for the couple of months leading up to the election, I'm thinking, where's the lawn signs at the very, she's got everybody on her side. She's got all the money. Can't they even get some lawn signs out? Like, I don't think they.
Not if your big concern is spying on somebody else. No, you don't. You missed the basics. And they did not see. The Republicans didn't think Trump was going to win. And we learned, and I hope this is what people remember about Trump being president. Many white people didn't care about the things we were told they cared about. So Trump said he wanted a better relationship with Russia. They said, okay, fine. Now, I think if he wanted to say he wanted to go to war with Russia, they would have said fine. He combined racism with anxiety about the state of the country. When he said he was going to bring back the industrial jobs, and he wasn't going to do that. But the fact remains, people are angry that they don't have living wage work. And I think he peeled off a few extra voters. He didn't just get votes from people who always voted for Republicans. I think he got new people to come out. But the Democratic response is to do what they did in 2016 and smear him with Russia, everything except giving people what they want.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they're bought off. And I don't know what's going to happen with Mueller's investigation or an indictment or an impeachment or a removal. I don't know. But I am not convinced that they win in 2020.
And I would say also that the Democrats need to look out for that this time around, because I believe, and of course this is my own speculation, that they're going to take a similar track this time. They're going to line up some issues. They're going to pretend to be for some form of Medicare for all. They're probably going to try to hit on some of the populist issues when they have no intention at all of ever following up on those promises. But I think one thing they probably did learn is to at least tell people you're going to address some of the main issues. But I don't think there's any sincerity in it at all.
They'll be better with their lip service will be better.
Oh,
I guess you're right. They will do that. But it's a difficult time, and we depend on these people who are terrible. They don't have our interests at heart, and they're not even smart. So they want to, they're trying to steal it from Bernie Sanders. He hasn't even announced yet.
Yeah.
And he's the one, if they were smart, they'd buy him off and co-opt him. But nope. They're, trying to talk up Kamala Harris. It's ridiculous. But I think if Bernie Sanders runs, and I think he will do well, he is the front runner. I mean, the media don't want to say that because they don't want him. But and I have problems with him. I have issues with Bernie Sanders, but I think he's the front runner. I think he would definitely win the nomination. I don't think it would be close, but they're going to find a way. They'll use super delegates or something to steal it from him. Because if they don't, the Democratic Party is going to split. Although I don't think that's a bad thing.
Right. Yeah. I was all in on the progressive wave in 2005, 6, 7, that time period, when we really thought we could reform the Democratic Party. And I'm just not falling for it this time. I don't think it's reformable.
No, they don't want to reform. I mean, it's like as individuals, you don't change unless you want to. They think they're just fine. They just use people to come out there, and they use the Republican boogeyman, and Trump will be the boogeyman forever in the way to keep progressives silent. But they don't want what we want. They don't want what we want. They don't want to give us the things we need. And they think they are just fine. They have no interest in changing, and this working from the inside, changing them from the inside is not going to work.
No. All right. Well, I've kept you for an hour, so should probably, if there's anything else we want to say about the speech. Honestly, I could talk about this for hours. There's so many things. I may cut some excerpts, some short clips from the speech into this podcast where they're relevant. But, let me know if there's anything else you want to say before we wrap up. And then also make sure you let everybody know where to find your work, how to support you.
Sure. I touched on being a member of the Black Alliance for Peace. And I hope your listeners go to tinyurl.com/shutdownafricom. And I know people are asked to sign petitions all the time, but this is part of our mobilization effort to end the U.S. presence in Africa. The U.S. Africa Command has taken control. Talk about imperialism. I touched on the foreign bases that are around the world. Many of them are in Africa, and Black Alliance for Peace and other organizations want AFRICOM to end, and we are mobilizing. We're going to approach the Congressional Black Caucus and ask them to take the lead and hold hearings and demand that AFRICOM end. So I hope people look at that. And also, I mentioned April 4th in Washington. There is a mobilization by a number of groups. So NATO, and I'm forgetting the website address.
That's okay. We'll put it in the show notes. Forget it.
People just search for No to NATO. They should be able to find it. There's going to be a peace festival in Washington on Saturday, March 30th, I believe that is, and Black Alliance for Peace and other groups are going to mobilize at the site of the NATO summit on April 4th and have a meeting that evening in Washington, D.C.
Okay. And then where can people find your work? Black Agenda Report is one place.
Mm-hmm. blackagendareport.com. I'm on Twitter at Freedom Ride Blog. Facebook I keep more private. I do have my own blog, freedomrider.blogspot.com.
And you have a Patreon, right?
I do. Patreon.com/Margaret Kimberley.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking with you, and I love your perspective, and I encourage people to check out the Black Agenda Report and Margaret's other work because, like, for example, I should let you know that during the Libya war, I tell you, I felt extremely isolated because I was dead set against that intervention. Mm-hmm. But I learned so much from that website, from all of you, that I had never known before. And I couldn't find that perspective really anywhere else. So,
well, thank you very much.
Again, thank you so much, and have a great night.
You too.
Hope to talk to you again.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
And that's our show. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Margaret Kimberley. Find her work at blackagendareport.com, at her blog freedomrider.blogspot.com. Follow her on Twitter at freedomrideblog, and her Patreon, patreon.com/Margaret Kimberley. Round the Empire Podcasts, independent media. Your support is really important. Please pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or do one-time donations via PayPal at paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. You can find these links on our website, aroundtheempire.com. The syndicated audio podcast has been the main focus for Around the Empire and where we have the most traffic. We're on most podcast apps like iTunes, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, so please subscribe to us there. And if you like us, click some stars for a good review. It helps ranking and visibility. I'd like to do some improvements and new kinds of content this year, including some video content and live streams. For this, I'll need to hire some freelance creatives, also need more subscribers on YouTube to build out that channel. Find the link for our YouTube channel in the show notes. Hit the red subscribe button. It's free, it won't bother you with notifications unless you choose to turn them on with the bell icon. Please use the thumbs up icon to like the individual videos. That also helps. Follow us on Twitter @AroundTheEmpire. See you next time. Take care, everyone.